there is almost no one. Margaret Thatcher was undoubtedly a conservative figure, but she failed in her most important task, which was to stop the centralisation of the European Union. One could, I suppose, say that Helmut Kohl was a conservative figure, more or less. But even his achievement of national unity, that was, yes, a conservative moment for Germany. That achievement of national unity for Germany was submerged and transformed at the very moment when it was realised into its very opposite, into the supranational project of the euro. And it is for this, for the euro and for the supranationalism, that he is now principally remembered in Germany and not positively. So what was happening in the Eastern Bloc during this period? Václav Klaus has argued many times, and he is right, that the Soviet system, the communist system, died on its feet, rather in the image of the aging Soviet and East European leaders of the time. But even in the West's attacks, justified though they may have been, on the Soviet gerontocracy, one can see, I think, again, evidence of this left-wing bias in the Western line of attack. Because, of course, hatred of the older generation is a specifically left-wing and revolutionary reflex, because it implies contempt for the past and a revolutionary cult of youth. By the time Gorbachev came along, he was feted deliriously in the West, not only because he was relatively young and vigorous, but also because he supported convergence between East and West. Gorbachev supported a sort of one-world syncretism, which has formed the backbone of the Western mental apparatus ever since the Second Vatican Council, and in some senses since the rise of secret societies devoted to the unity of man in the 18th century. When Francis Fukuyama served up his warmed-up dish of Hegelianism that he'd taken out of the intellectual fridge in 1989, he had phenomenal success with this rather second-rate idea, and certainly a second-hand idea, precisely because the West was deeply impregnated with a historical determinism, which was very dear to Marxists. In other words, with a yearning for an end to politics and for an end to the state. That, I think, was the key to the delirious welcome of Gorbachev and to the extraordinary success of this rather mediocre essay by Fukuyama, which then became a book. So, by the time the communist bloc collapsed, and this is my second claim this evening, the soil in the West had already been fertile for a very long time for a universalist, progressive, and cosmopolitan ideology. And that is why I believe that all the supranational reforms of the 1990s and the 2000s flow from this one-world cosmopolitan ideology. The New World Order that President George Bush, the father, proclaimed on the 11th of September 1990 is the most obvious example of this. But there are many others. The new strategic concept of NATO, proclaimed in Rome in 1991. The new interventionism first practiced in Iraq, according to the terms of Resolution 688, passed in April 1991. That resolution specifically punished Iraq for matters concerning Iraq's internal affairs, for the first time in international relations. Then, of course, the interventionism practiced in Yugoslavia from April 1992 onwards. The creation of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe in November 1990. The Maastricht Treaty, agreed in December 1991. The creation of the International Criminal Tribunals for Yugoslavia and Rwanda, created in 1993 and 1994, the transformation of the GATT into the World Trade Organization in 1995, the adoption by NATO of a new strategic concept in 1999 at the height of its bombing campaign against Yugoslavia, the entry into force of the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court on the 1st of July 2002, the clause invoking a responsibility to protect, in other words, justifying interventionism, responsibility to protect populations against genocide and so on. This clause was inserted into the conclusions of the World Summit in 2005. Most recently, the NATO regime change operation disguised as humanitarian intervention in Libya last year. All these are examples of political globalization. And of course, they come on the back of the inexorable rise of globalization through the increase in the means of electronic communication, which is itself, is, if you like, genuine globalization. The fact that everyone has email now and there are all these social networking sites. This itself is instrumentalized in the service of political globalization. In other words, people say, well, because the world is now so much in touch with, there is so much international communication, that there must therefore be a supranational world government. This instrumentalization of a technological development for political purposes is, in my view, exactly the logic of Karl Marx, who said the hand mill gives you society with the feudal lord, the steam mill society with the industrial capitalist. Marx, as you know, argued that political structures were nothing but a superstructure over the underlying reality of the economy. And so by the same logic, the internet gives you world government. What is essential, in my view, to understand is that all these important institutional changes, all the ones that I have just listed, are inspired by the idea that the state is the antithesis of freedom. In my view, this idea that the state is a threat to freedom is not a conservative position. The wars in Yugoslavia were seen precisely through this prism, even though it's a very distorted prism. And in my view, they were made worse by it. On the one side, you had, according to this view of things, you had post-national progressives in Slovenia. They called for Europe now, if you remember. And to some extent, Croatia was viewed in that way. On the other side, you had reactionary nationalists, the Serbs. And what struck me was that the response to these wars in Yugoslavia, and also to the collapse of the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact, was that the West was afraid of the creation of new free states. It was literally afraid. The great fear in the run-up to the dissolution of the Warsaw Pact was of nationalism in the newly liberated states of Eastern Europe. I well remember this in the period 1988-1989. The Germans, not only that, but the Germans devised plans which were eventually realized with the euro to create a new supranational structure to replace the old Soviet one, and thus to ensure stability in Europe. The British Prime Minister, John Major, gave the game away when he attributed the civil war in Yugoslavia to, I quote, the collapse of the Soviet Union and of the discipline which that exerted over ancient ethnic hatreds. He'd evidently never heard of Tito's split with Stalin in 1948. But even the movements in the Baltic states, which of course led to the collapse of the Soviet Union, and which therefore, as it were, should have been welcomed by the West because they delivered a gigantic geopolitical victory to it. Even the secession of the Baltic states was denounced as nationalist in 1988. Helmut Kohl, who dominated the European Union process and the creation of the euro, never ceased to repeat that nations lead to nationalism, which leads to war. And this philosophy inspired the creation of supranational institutions, especially the OSCE and its principal body, the Organization for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights, whose job, as you probably know, is to oversee human rights in post-communist societies and to oversee their elections. The underlying assumption in all these examples is that the state is likely to be an abuser of freedom and not the guarantor of freedom. And that's why, and I now come to my third point, my third argument, third claim, that's why so many communist practices have intensified in the West since the end of the Cold War. I'd like to mention two practices which I consider to be communist ones, which have, if you like, migrated from Eastern Europe and now are accepted all over the world. The first is the adoption by the West, the wholesale adoption by the West, intellectual adoption of the concept of revolution. Revolution is now seen as an unmistakably positive phenomenon. During the Cold War, this was not the case. The Soviet propaganda obviously always talked about revolution, and that was treated as kitsch, as infantile propaganda. But this same idea now is received at face value and is regarded as wholly positive. This trend started with the various coloured or botanical revolutions in Eastern Europe. The uprising against Milosevic in October 2000, the Rose Revolution in Georgia in 2003, the Orange Revolution in Ukraine in 2004, and so on. And it's continued through to this decade with the very 1960s label Arab Spring. The phrase Arab Spring is obviously meant to recall the Prague Spring. And just as the Soviet Union thought that revolutionary movements in the Third World would promote pro-Soviet foreign policy attitudes and would confirm the march of humanity towards the future communist utopia, so the assumption today is that all revolutionary movements, whether they are in Belgrade or in Benghazi, Tehran or Tbilisi, will similarly promote the unity of mankind around pro-American, free trade, postmodernist, post-national and liberal principles. Now, connected to this obsession with the idea of revolution is the, in my view, equally left-wing doctrine of the sanctity of non-governmental organizations, NGOs. These, of course, are by definition not state organizations and are therefore not governed by the laws which govern state bodies, although they're very often funded by states, notably by the EU, or by members of the EU and by the United States. But NGOs, as you know in this country, but as is the case across Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union, have been elevated to the level of political sainthood precisely by this prevalent anti-state ideology. Very often they're used to disrupt or overturn state processes, such as, for example, when they get involved in elections. There are a number of cases, particularly in the year 2000, in Georgia, for example, where NGOs took over a considerable role in the counting of the vote. And these NGOs are therefore, in my opinion, the ideological equivalent of Soviets in the early Bolshevik period. Soviets, by which I mean councils. They are supposedly spontaneous associations of concerned citizens. And therefore, in the name of the very Hegelian and therefore proto-Marxist concept of civil society, they have, just like the Soviet councils, they have wielded immense political power by profiling themselves as virtuous precisely because not political, and by then using that supposed moral superiority to influence the outcome of elections and public opinion. At the same time, the proliferation of human rights law has also taken political disputes out of the political arena, out of the public arena, and put them instead in the hands of judges. Incidentally, judges who don't necessarily have any legal training, who then make their decisions behind closed doors. So this trend is ideologically very important, and we've seen an umpteenth example of the dangerous power that is given to NGOs in the legislation passed 10 days ago, on the 16th of November, in the United States House of Representatives, the Russia and Moldova Jackson Valley Repeal Act of 2005. This is a piece of legislation which the Congress has been forced to adopt because Russia has joined the World Trade Organization. And therefore, the old legislation dating back to the 1970s, which put trade restrictions on Russia because it refused to allow Jews to immigrate to Israel, had to be repealed. But when they repealed it, when the Congress repealed it, it introduced new punitive measures into a new law, replacing the old one, this time for Russia, against Russia, because of the death of the lawyer Sergei Magnitsky. We remember that a prominent Russian-American tax lawyer died in custody a few years ago. Now, not only does this law reintroduce punitive measures, but it specifically gives non-governmental organizations the right to provide information to the President of the United States on this issue. It's frankly as if one were to contract out the work of the Federal Bureau of Investigation to Greenpeace. So, the second flagrant adoption of a communist practice that I would like to mention is the creation of international criminal tribunals with the power to prosecute state leaders. We all know that communist regimes were notorious for abusing the judicial process. And yet in the 1990s, the West has happily backed the creation of new supranational tribunals with no thought at all to the potential for abuse by them. The International Criminal Court, which started operations in 2002, and which has already either issued indictments or opened investigations into situations in countries which are not signatory states of its statute, and which therefore, according to the fundamental principles of international law, cannot be bound by its terms. I'm referring to Sudan and Libya. Sudan was referred in 2009, Libya in 2011. This court was created after a conference was convened in New York in 1995 by a non-governmental organization called the Coalition for an International Criminal Court. As it happens, the head of this non-governmental organization is also the executive director of something called the World Federalist Movement, which overtly promotes the creation of the United Nations as a nuclear-armed world government. I'm not exaggerating. You can check it on their website. Now, the anti-state character of these tribunals derives from their explicit assumption that states are perpetrators of human rights abuses, whereas officials of supranational bodies are not. That is the underlying assumption. The Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court denies immunity to state leaders in Article 27, although in fact they enjoy it, but it gives immunity to its own judges and prosecutors who are immune from prosecution of any kind according to Article 48. So the similarities with early Bolshevik practice are really striking. The similarities are striking, of course, with the more famous later practice, the Moscow show trials, the trials in the Slansky trial in this country. But there are similarities also with the very early Bolshevik practice, because modern international tribunals often stress that they have a didactic role, a pedagogical role. The International Criminal Court, for example, regularly organizes workshops to propagate its message. And it's also started broadcasting its own trials, and even organizing plays to get its message across. Its trials, for example, have been broadcast in the Central African Republic and in the Congo. While in 2009 a play was staged in Congo, in Ituri, called The ICC, Our Hope. I'm going to read you, if you don't mind. I promise not to read any more quotations. The ICC press release. Following the brief summary of the background to the case, a play was put on by the local theatre group La Voix d'Ituri, the Voice of Ituri, on the theme, The ICC, Our Hope. The audience applauded enthusiastically in recognition of the artistic quality of the play and the relevance of the message regarding the mission of the ICC, the crimes which fall within its jurisdiction, and the various ways in which cases may be referred to it. That's the press release. In June 2011, that was in 2009, in June 2011, the ICC staged fictitious hearings in its own courtroom. This was part of a competition between university teams. They staged fictitious hearings in the ICC courtroom in front of real ICC judges. And the goal was obviously to choose the best competing team. Now, why do I say this reminds me of early Bolshevik practice? Because in the early years of the Soviet Union, the Soviet authorities frequently organized mock trials for electoral purposes. These were the so-called agitation trials. There's a very good book about it by an American historian, Elizabeth Wood. These agitation trials were also mock events. But some of them were indeed organized in the same courtrooms where real trials had taken place, just like in the case of the ICC. And for that matter, this strange practice of blending real trials with pretend trials came to its most horrific expression when the communist poet Mayakovsky proposed lending his own theatre in Moscow to the Soviet authorities for the purpose of carrying out executions on stage. Anyway, that's the most extreme example of this logic. But to come back to the mock trials, there was one mock trial of the October Revolution, where the revolution was put on trial, and it had actors playing Lloyd George, and it had a Kulak as a prosecutor. I'm going to read you the Pravda report from 1920. Among the non-party audience members, this trial aroused a great deal of interest. When they first put up the signs, workers asked if they could come, what kind of trial this was, and so on. 300 people came to the trial. There were more who wanted to get in, and there was space in the building. Mostly they were non-party railway workers, soldiers and women workers. The audience listened with bated breath. There is literally no difference between this quotation from Pravda in 1920 and the press release from the International Criminal Court that I read out to you just now. So, what about Russia in all this? I've said I would talk about Europe, Russia and leftism. I think the matter is fairly straightforward. Russia, in the period 1991 to 1998, experienced a double collapse of her state. First, of course, the Soviet Union was dissolved. We often think of the collapse of the Warsaw Pact, the dissolution of the Warsaw Pact, and the collapse of the Soviet Union as parts of one seamless process. To some extent, it was part of a seamless process, but we should never forget that the territory of the Soviet Union was historic Russian territory, as a matter of historical fact. The Bolsheviks did not extend the territory of the Soviet Union beyond Russia's historical borders. And that is why I say the Russians experienced a double collapse of their state. Because the breakup of the Soviet Union into different and sometimes hostile states is, and I know this is controversial, it's a historical absurdity. especially when you remember that these new republics include places like Ukraine and Belarus, which are historically, culturally and ethnically Russian, admittedly with some minorities, but they are historically part of the historic Russian state. So that was the first collapse. And then second, in 1998, the reforms which Yeltsin unleashed onto Russia, during which the economy was chopped up into little pieces and thrown to the oligarchs, much as you would throw a piece of meat to a crocodile, led to terrible ravages on the Russian economy and society, including to a catastrophic drop in its population, to terrible hardship on the level of ordinary people's lives. And of course this all culminated, as you remember, in the collapse of the currency, the collapse of the ruble, and a default on the debt in 1998, followed by the humiliation of the attack on Yugoslavia in 1999. So by 1999, the Russians, in my view, realized that they had abandoned one world ideology, communism, only to adopt another one world ideology, liberalism, and that both of them had destroyed their state. And I think that from that time, they realized it was time to abandon ideology and instead to undertake the work of rebuilding the state. And it's since then that Putin came onto the stage. He was appointed Prime Minister at the end of 1999 or early 2000, and ever since he became President after Yeltsin, he has, for good or ill, identified himself and been identified with a process of national reconstruction and stabilization. Now, we can perhaps during the discussion talk about whether he's a good president or a bad president, but I don't think it can be denied that he is associated with the project of national rebirth. Although, to be honest, some of the processes for which he takes credit were frankly started under Yeltsin. But I want to mention two aspects of this national reconstruction. The first is the extraordinary growth of the activities of the Russian Orthodox Church. The reconstruction of the Christ the Saviour Cathedral in Moscow, which was built in after 1812 as an act of thanksgiving for the existential victory over Napoleon, was destroyed by Stalin and replaced by a swimming pool. The swimming pool was filled in, and thanks to donations from over 1 million citizens, the church was rebuilt in 1996. It's only the most obvious example of a much broader trend, because there are hundreds of new churches and monasteries that have been built or reopened all over Russia, and for example in 2010 the church obtained permission to build no fewer than 200 new churches in Moscow alone. As an indication of this very remarkable rise in religious observance, when President Medvedev came to Paris on a state visit in 2010, he took an hour out of his official program to go to the cathedral in Paris, Notre Dame, to venerate the crown of thorns which St. Louis bought from the Byzantine emperor in 1238 for the equivalent, incidentally, of $40 million. If you do the calculation in terms of the amount paid in gold, it comes to the equivalent of $40 million. So, whereas during the Cold War the West attacked Russia because it suppressed freedom of religion, now its restored freedom has given rise to a sharp increase in religious practice in Russia, which of course is in direct contrast to the situation in the West. And yet, the West's reaction, having earlier attacked the Russians for suppressing freedom of religion, is to ridicule and scorn this rebirth. And I would go so far as to say that the West has adopted and is pursuing a specifically anti-Christian agenda, both at home and in its foreign policy. And that is why our leaders unanimously condemned the Pussy Riot demonstrators. They can unanimously support the Pussy Riot demonstrators, whereas the French Prime Minister, for example, issued a very strong condemnation last month when a group of young nationalists climbed on onto the roof of the mosque in Poitiers to unfurl a banner recording the famous Battle of Poitiers, where the Muslims were repulsed in the year 732. In other words, there's a quite clear support for anti-Christian demonstrators and an attack on Christian ones. The second issue, which I would like to mention in this process of national reconstruction in Russia, is the very difficult task that the Russians have undertaken of putting together fragments of their national identity which had been blown apart by the Bolshevik Revolution and by the Civil War. I think perhaps the most emblematic event of this was the reburial of the remains of General Denikin in Moscow in 2005. General Denikin was the leader of the White Russian forces during the Russian Civil War. And I think it's striking that the Russians have tried to renew, obviously, with their pre-revolutionary history, with their imperial history, Tsarist period, but without trying to airbrush away out of historical memory the Soviet period, which, as you know, is a period of which many people have very fond memories because they remember Brezhnev, they don't remember Stalin. And this process, even the process of effacing the communist memory is underway. There's been a recent suggestion that the remaining statues of Lenin should be taken down from Russian cities. But I think the most important thing, and this is really the thought that I would like to stress, is that Russia, having experienced these two collapses, has abandoned ideology, and now, in my view, behaves more or less like an ordinary state. Like an ordinary state. There aren't very many other ordinary states, but I think it's behaving as an ordinary state. That is to say, Russia tries to look after her own people, tries to run the state as best as she can, and she, of course, tries to play a role on the international stage. She does not proselytize or pursue an ideological agenda, unlike the Americans and unlike the Europeans. In the conflict over Syria, Russia stands now for the established international order, including for the rules of sovereignty and non-intervention. She stands for existing international law against attempts by the United States and its allies to undermine these principles, international law and non-intervention, in the name of worldwide democratic revolution and human rights. In the conflict over Syria, we can see this left-right distinction very clearly. The United States is in favor of revolution and regime change, whereas Russia, which is to say on the left, whereas Russia is on the side of the law and the state. In other words, it's an unambiguously right-wing position, if we use these terms technically and not judgmentally. And this, I believe, this fact that Russia is renewing with what I call normal, ordinary state practice, is the reason for the West's, I call the West's obsession with the personality of Vladimir Putin. What people don't appreciate is that on the Russian political stage, Putin is a center-left figure. He is a center-left, if you like, social democratic figure. He has to his right the economic liberals and to the extreme right hardline nationalists. To his left he has the Communist Party. These are his main rivals in the political spectrum. So he is, by default, a centre-left figure, and indeed he sees himself in that way. But he's systematically presented in the West as a right-wing tyrant. I personally think our obsession with him is exaggerated. and simplistic. It's basically the only thing that people know about Russia, evil Mr. Putin. But I think the reason for this obsession is that the West, by and large correctly, identifies Putin, for whatever reason, with Russia's national reconstruction. And the very fact that national rebirth should be a dirty word in the West, as it is, shows, I think, how far left we have travelled. And I'd like to conclude, therefore, with this final remark, which I offer to you in a spirit of undiluted provocation. The Soviet experience and the Warsaw Pact is seen today as a specifically Russian national phenomenon. Whereas Soviet communism saw itself as a worldwide, progressive, ideological movement which opposed imperialism, the West has turned the tables and now attacks Soviet communism in precisely the same left-wing terms as an exclusively Russian, nationalist, imperialist phenomenon. Communism, though, was a worldwide movement. It had supporters all over the planet, from Cuba to China. And as we know, the Soviet Union was not always governed by Russians. Moreover, communist governments in Eastern Europe were, without wishing to deny the obvious geopolitical role of the Red Army and the Cold War, the fact remains that communist governments in Eastern Europe were run and supported by convinced communists who were Czechs, Germans, Poles, and so on. So it's my conviction that the depiction of the Soviet experience and of the Warsaw Pact as a purely Russian, national, imperialist phenomenon is in fact the final and decisive victory of Lenin over the intellectual landscape of the West. Thank you very much.
Nyní už určitě každý dobře chápe, proč John Laughland nedostává pozvánky na Fórum 2000. Hledal, že by do programu konference zařadili politické procesy nebo něco takového, pak bylo možná pozvali. Takže tisíceré díky a nyní si můžete to všechno přebrat, svoje myšlenky z přednášky. Máme teď před sebou 10minutovou přestávku, pak budete moct pokládat svoje dotazy, takže zase se tu sejdeme v půl osmé začíná diskuze.